So there are really two ways, I think, that we could approach the conversation this morning. One is, of course, to think of ministering to those who suffer trauma in the church, and the other, indeed, is to approach the subject of thinking how we minister to a church that is traumatized by its history. And I really want to try and do both in this presentation with you this morning to see how these two things might in fact correlate. One of the principal premises underlying the publication earlier this year of the new National Response Protocol for the Church in Australia, responding to allegations and concerns of the abuse of children, was that all response must be trauma-informed. All response must be trauma-informed. As enunciated in Principle B of the protocol, we read this: all children and adults involved in matters relating to concerns or allegations of abuse must be provided with a just and compassionate response that respects the dignity and the diversity of all involved. All engagement with victims, survivors, and others affected must be trauma-informed, with an understanding and commitment to pastoral care and treatment with the kindness and understanding at the heart of the gospel. The courage and resilience of those harmed must be recognised, with full regard to what is known about the nature and the impact of institutional abuse. Ways must be in place to monitor and support respondents who are the subject of a concern or allegation of abuse. Now, this indeed goes through the entire protocol, that our responses must be always trauma-informed. But what do we actually understand by being trauma-informed? And here we have been particularly helped by the work of the New South Wales Office of the Children's Guardian. Last year they published a very helpful booklet called Engaging Sensitively with Survivors of Abuse, a guide for faith organisations. And I thoroughly recommend that you look this up and that you take this to heart. It's a very fine document and one that indeed can guide us well into the future. And they there, very helpfully, as I say, define what a trauma-informed response might look like. And they identify these 6 characteristics of a trauma-informed response. The first being safety. And to this, they say, understanding what makes a safe environment for each unique survivor's experience, given the context of their abuse, is critical. Creating a safe environment. But safety, as it says, also relates to relationships, the experience of authority figures, and psychological well-being. Because of this, as it reads, never assume that a particular environment is perceived as being safe. Always be mindful and ask survivors about where, by whom, and in what context they would like to meet. Creating an environment of safety is to respond in a trauma-informed way. Never presume that what I might think as safe is perceived as safe by another. The second element of a trauma-informed response is trustworthiness and transparency, because this is usually the very antithesis of a survivor's experience of abuse, which always emerges from a history of secrecy, manipulation, and a betrayal of trust, all of which carry the very weight of the trauma that has been experienced. Trust has been broken, and trust is not easy to rebuild. It takes time. So it's also always very important in a trauma-informed response to start by admitting our organisation's responsibility for the abuse. and we need to consult with survivors and think carefully about what they need and how we can prepare to help them. I think this is critical, trustworthiness. For someone who's been traumatized by abuse, trust has been broken. And so how do we build up a new sense of capability for trust? The third aspect of a trauma-informed response is collaboration and mutuality. Because we recognise that abuse of power is paramount in the deliberate harm of children. And therefore, organisations should critically examine their role in creating and maintaining power relationships. In other words, we're being challenged here to ask, what are the relationships of power that are afoot in our own situation? And how do these get played out, particularly in our response to those who may have suffered abuse? And so we are committed by this principle to reverse those power relationships by identifying them for a start and then balancing power differences to recognise the value and the contribution of survivors. This is also critical. The fourth aspect of a trauma-informed response is providing empowerment, voice and choice. Because offenders steal both trust and power from children. And so we need to recognise the resilience of survivors and indeed their ability to heal. So we are looking for opportunities for survivors' voices to be heard, including sharing their experiences of abuse. And it's precisely the knowledge that we gain from listening to their voice that help us indeed, knowing how better we can create a culture of safety and care. The fifth response is one animated by peer support, because abuse can be an extremely isolating experience. It's driven, of course, by offenders trying to instill secrecy, by making survivors feel guilt and shame. And so peer support can break down this isolation and create pathways for understanding and for healing. And the sixth part of a trauma-informed response is recognising the cultural, historical and gender issues and how they can play a part in creating an environment in which abuse can flourish. And so we need to explore our own biases, our own stereotypes and our own roles, and indeed seek to address them. Again, all in all, to create an environment of safety. Now, these six aspects of a trauma-informed response, I think, are vital, because what we are proposing is that a trauma-informed response is essential, lest we engage in a re-traumatization for people, and a re-traumatization which has all too often marked people's experience of our church in the past. Not to be conscious and not to be working mindfully with these six characteristics of a trauma-informed response too easily would lead to the re-traumatization of others. And at all times, our ministry and our responses must seek to avoid the possibility of re-traumatization. Now, to help us a little bit more in this, I want to turn to to just explore a little bit more about the nature of trauma and why, therefore, a trauma-informed response is so critical in ministering to those who may have been abused within our church. And in this, I'm very much influenced by Cathy Caruth's work some 20 or so years ago, 25 years ago, Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative and History. Because Caruth demonstrates, using a literary analogy, that the term trauma is understood as a wound inflicted not upon the body, but upon the mind. But as she goes on to say, but what seems to be suggested by Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle is that the wound of the mind, the breach in the mind's experience of time, self and the world, is not like the wound in the body, a simple but healable event, but rather an event that, like Tancred's first infliction of a mortal wound on the disguised Clorinda in the duel, obviously they're referring to a literary classic, is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it opposes itself again, repeatedly, in the nightmares and repetitive actions of the survivor. So what we are dealing with in trauma is not simply a healable event, but rather an event that, because it's been experienced too soon, too unexpectedly, can never be actually fully known, and therefore never fully available to consciousness. This is what constitutes the nature of trauma. And because of this, it is always the always the story of a wound that cries out, that addresses us in the attempt to tell us of a reality of truth that is not otherwise available. For a person suffering trauma, the experience is not entirely available to them. This is what makes it traumatic, as quite distinct from a physical wound. So in other words, something catastrophic has been experienced. But both the impact and the import of that event have not been able to be fully grasped by the subject. And so what returns to haunt the victim is not only the reality of the violent event, but also the reality of the way that its violence has not yet been fully known. And therefore the story of trauma as the narrative of a belated experience, far from telling an escape from the reality, the escape from a death, rather attests to its endless impacts on a life. And so the crisis at the core of many traumatic narratives often emerges indeed as an urgent question. Is the trauma the encounter with death, or the ongoing experience of having survived it? And so, as Caruth would say, at the core of these stories, I would suggest, is thus a kind of double telling. The oscillation between a crisis of death on the one hand, and the correlative crisis of life on the other, between the story of the unbearable nature of the event and the story of the unbearable nature of its survival. This is why trauma is so complex. It's not something we can simply get over. It's not something we can put behind us so that we can get on with the rest of life. It's something, because of its very catastrophic nature, continues to represent itself for resolution. But the resolution is never quite able to be grasped. And so in trauma, there is always a radical tension. As Caruth would say, what is enigmatically suggested is that the trauma consists in not only having confronted death, but in having passed beyond, in having survived precisely without knowing it. And what one returns to in the flashback is not the incomprehensibility of one's near death, but the very incomprehensibility of one's own survival. And it's precisely because of this then that trauma, the memory of trauma, becomes something radically repetitive, because in each time the trauma represents itself, there is the claim being made for one's survival. And so, as Caruth would suggest, if history is to be understood as the history of trauma, it is a history that is experienced as the endless attempt to assume one's survival as one's own. Well, because of this, according to this writer, the survival of trauma then is not the fortunate passage beyond a violent event, a passage that is accidentally interrupted by reminders of it, but rather the endless inherent necessity of repetition, which of course can lead to destruction. The examples of repetition compulsion all seem to point to the necessity by which consciousness, once faced with the possibility of its death, could do nothing but repeat that destructive event over and over again. And this becomes part of our character. Well, I wanted to spend some time just exploring the depths of the experience of trauma to, as we can see, underscore its complexity. And so when we understand, even albeit ever so briefly, the nature of that complexity, we recognize that trauma is not something we get over. It's not something that we put behind us. Now, because of the inherent unresolved tension that trauma represents, trauma is something that is always present and which gets lived out time and time again as the tension seeks its resolution. And thus it becomes part of the very character of a person's life. More so, of course, if the trauma is experienced very early in life. And so it represents a radical question in a person's very being. To borrow a sentiment from a Spanish writer, Shaber, there are questions in human life that, like a door, must be kept open. A door that invites people to set out for the fullness of life. We should not become frightened in the face of the greatness and the challenges of these types of questions, which forever leave their mark on our lives. But of course, we are frightened by them, because they represent such a depth of wound in us, not just in our bodies, but as Caruth has illustrated, in our minds. And that's a much more profound wound. In the face then of both the torturous complexity and the painful power of trauma, how then might we move forward? How are we to minister in what might be a trauma-laden environment? How do we reach out to those who carry the complexity of the wound of trauma deep within them? Well, the 6 principles of a trauma-informed response with which we began, of course, are very important and most instrumental in being able to answer that question. But I want to focus with you now particularly on the 4th of those principles, which was empowerment, voice and choice. Because I think this one, not that it's any more significant than any of the others, of course, all of them are equally important, all of them are intertwined with one another. But I just want to focus on this one for our gathering this morning, because I think this one we can open up perhaps in a creative but also a constructive way. So you might recall empowerment, voice and choice. Faith organisations, as the New South Wales Office of the Children's Guardian wrote, should recognise and honour the resilience of survivors and their ability to heal. And they should create opportunities for survivors' voices to be heard, including sharing their experience of abuse. Well, with this, I want to engage a framework that I've adapted from Arthur W. Frank's 1994 classic study on the sociology of illness, The Wounded Storyteller, Body, Illness and Ethics. That's Arthur W. Frank there on our screen, because I think Frank's insights about illness have a lot to offer us in how we might respond to trauma, to those who have been traumatized, and indeed to the reality of us being a church in trauma. And that's, of course, a very powerful thing for us to acknowledge. Arthur Frank, whom we see here, he was a professor of sociology at the University of Calgary. And he sought to provide an analytical study of the various narratives by which people seek to address overwhelming or terminal illness. He can be thought of as a sociologist of illness. But he was dealing primarily with people who had received very difficult prognoses of cancer. But I think, as I say, he has a great deal to teach us about how we respond to the reality of trauma, both in our own lives, if that be the case, but also in the life of the community of the church. And he suggests in this book, The Wounded Storyteller, which I thoroughly recommend to you, is that we respond to these very painful and complex situations through three narratives. The first narrative can be what he calls the narrative of restitution. The second possibility is that we respond with what he calls the narrative of chaos. And the third narrative that we can develop to the complexity of our woundedness is the narrative of quest. And so let me just explain what he means by these. The narrative of restitution commits itself exclusively to recovery, to the goal of health. It's the narrative with which doctors first work with us in our illness. We will adopt this treatment. In receiving this treatment, you will get well. And so it tries to map out the road to full recovery. And of course, it's very important for somebody particularly who may have a serious medical illness that they have a sense of hope because of the health and medical plan that might be provided them. But Frank suggests that in fact this becomes inadequate, particularly when it becomes evident that there is no recovery, that the wound is too, or the illness is too deep, or in our situation, the trauma is not something that can be overcome. And then what we see is a disconnect between the medical assurances and the lived reality. And this becomes all too great. And then, of course, we see, particularly in the medical arena, other implications begin to amplify distress, the loss of job, the loss of housing, for example. And then, so what people then so easily can move into is what he calls the narrative of chaos. It's all now so overwhelming. It's all too much. And those living chaos, of course, are so overwhelmed that they cannot really tell any kind of story about what they're going through because they lack any sense of a viable future. Life is reduced to a series of present tense assaults. Well, according to Frank, neither of these narratives, the narrative of restitution or the narrative of chaos, is really satisfactory to the experience of someone facing terminal illness or in an analogous way, in terms of what we're speaking of this morning, to those who are suffering trauma. The narrative of restitution won't do it, because trauma, as we've suggested, is not something we can put behind us, not something that we can get over so that we can get on with the rest of our lives. It's not of the nature of trauma to admit that. For a lot of us who may suffer trauma, we can get lost, however, in the narrative of chaos. And we find ourselves in a morass of not going anywhere and sinking as a result. So he says, because in both of these narratives, the narrative of restitution and the narrative of chaos, we see in fact an increasing diminishment of the self. The self is getting less and less and getting lost and further lost. And so what he says is that we need another kind of narrative to bring us through, yes, even in the face of the inevitability of death in the medical field, but particularly, as we were saying for ourselves in the discussion this morning, in the inevitability that trauma is never, in fact, entirely resolved. And so as he recounts, a sequence of experiences brought me out of an obsession with my own pain and vulnerability, and gave me a sense that I was participating in something shared. The attitude is the basis of understanding one's story as a quest narrative. As a quest narrative. Illness remains a nightmare, he says, in many ways, just as trauma remains ever present. But it can also become a possibility, especially for a more intimate level of connection with others. And this is how he comes to the title of his study. The narrative of quest creates new communities of shared experience. And so as he says, thus the wounded storyteller, ending silences, speaking truths, creating communities, becomes the wounded healer. We may never be able to overcome the illness that we have. We may never be able to resolve the trauma that we carry, but we can share the story. And as he suggests, it's precisely in sharing the story that we create new communities of shared experience. And it's those, it's the cultivation of new communities of shared experience that in fact begins to end the silence, speak the truth, and offer hope. And so as Frank points out, restitution stories attempt to outdistance mortality by rendering illness transitory. Chaos stories sucked into the undertow of illness and the disasters that attend to it. But quest stories meet suffering head on. They accept illness, or in our case, trauma, and they seek to use it. And so illness, or trauma in our case, can become the occasion of a journey that can become a quest. What is quested for many may never be wholly clear. But the quest is defined by the ill person's belief that something is to be gained through the experience. And so for Frank, what makes an illness story good is the act of witness that says implicitly or explicitly, I will tell you not what you want to hear, but what I know to be true, because I have lived it. This truth will trouble you, but in the end you cannot be free without it, because you know it already. Your body knows it already. So in the quest narrative, which he suggests is the only truly constructive way forward that accepts a reality but also offers a possibility in that reality, the one who is affected finds their voice as the teller of their own story. However, as they find their voice and tell their story, something happens because of the very nature of storytelling. The self-story, as he writes, is never just a self-story, but becomes as self-other story. And so Frank highlights that in the telling of a story, my story of illness, or my story of trauma, three ethics begin to emerge. The ethic of what he calls the ethic of recollection, the ethic of solidarity and commitment, and the ethic of inspiration. Well, the ethic of recollection is remembering and telling the story as it has been, not how you want to hear it, but how I know it to be true, because I've lived it. But an ethic of solidarity and commitment is expressed, as he writes, when the storyteller offers their voice to others, not to speak for them, but to speak with them as a fellow sufferer, who for whatever reasons of talent or opportunity does have the chance to speak, while others do not. And this, he says, translates into an ethic of inspiration because we need exemplars who are heroic. That is, those whose story shared is rooted in woundedness, their agony not concealed. And this is what makes, of course, for the hero is not the celebrity. The hero is the one who has gone through the woundedness of life and found a possibility. This is what he calls the ethic of inspiration. And so in all of this, then, he says, storytelling creates solidarity, and solidarity creates resistance. Resistance to all that would truncate our dignity and our value. Yes, even in the face of suffering, of death, and of unresolved trauma. So what we're suggesting here is that Frank's study details responses to terminal physical illness, but I think it is a framework that has a great deal of application for us as a church, encountering the trauma of sexual and spiritual abuse within our community. We would fall to the restitution narrative if our response were simply one of explanation and protocol. Simply relying on the development of protocols, important as they are, is in fact to relegate ourselves purely to the narrative of restitution. The chaos narrative would be, of course, a betrayal of our understanding of the very mystery of redemption. Rather, the only genuine way forward is to commit to a narrative of quest, to break the silence and sit before the stories of trauma, to encourage those stories to be told, not just in the anonymity and obscurity of mediation rooms, but in the sanctuaries and in the seminaries. In other words, not privately, but publicly. As the Chicago philosopher of religion, David Tracy, as Anita mentioned, who's had an influence on my own thinking, wrote, yes, those voices can seem strident and sibilant, in a word, other. And they are. We've all just begun, he wrote, to sense the terror of that otherness. But only beginning to listen to those other voices may we also begin to hear the otherness within our own discourse and within ourselves. What we might then begin to hear above our own chatter are possibilities we never dared to dream. So this is the possibility in the storytelling of those who have suffered abuse in our church. The voice is other than the church's self-image. It's other than the church's rhetoric about itself and its intentions. It's other than the face of harmony and well-being. And thus it confronts complacency and delusion. It opens, and not without terror, new possibilities of being, as does all authentic conversation with that who is other. The otherness of the voice of the one who has suffered disrupts and transgresses our idealized rhetoric, and that's precisely why it's so important. Of course, stories of trauma within our church are told publicly, although primarily at the moment through the media. One would have to ask, have people any other forum by which to tell their story? And this absence is an enormous indictment on us as a community of healing. If the media is the only place where people can have their stories told publicly, what does that say for us as a community of healing? And so, as I suggested, we still have a very long way to go in being able to create places of safety in which people can share their story, in which I can share my story, and together we can create a new community of shared story, and as the wounded storytellers become wounded healers. What might happen, though, if we were truly prepared to sit with and listen deeply to the pain of stories, and to wonder in the encounter with such pain how trauma and the full reality of it might act as a catalyst for theology, that is, for our understanding of God and for our self-understanding as church. How does people's pain, in this instance, shape our sense of God, of Christ, of the church, of redemption? As a church, we are not used to listening, we're used to proclaiming. We're not used to asking questions, we're used to giving the answers. We're not used to serving one another from their terms, we're used to giving on our terms. We're not used to asking for forgiveness, we of course are used to dispensing forgiveness. Yet the narrative of quest about which we've been speaking relies on both conversation and conversion. These two words of conversation and conversion, which Anita got muddled up at the beginning, and quite understandably, because they're very obviously akin to one another. Their very similarity implies that conversion occurs through conversation. Conversation can become a means of deep conversion. And so we as a community must risk a conversation in which it acknowledges a mutual vulnerability, which it must allow so that this conversation becomes a means of conversion, an avenue of change. And thus conversation becomes a most profound sacrament of conversion. The undeniable and unavoidable presence of trauma in our midst thus becomes the invitation for us to become wounded storytellers, to embark upon a narrative of quest, encouraging the stories of those who have been traumatized in a way that respects all of those other principles of a trauma-informed response, especially that of safety. We too can tell our story of being wounded, and in the telling discover that solidarity with suffering from which alone the God of our scriptures is known. Wounded storytellers become wounded healers.
Thank you, Father David, for your reflections. I really loved how you carefully uncovered the emotions people experience when a dialogue of trauma is revealed. It was particularly interesting to hear of the concept of the wounded storyteller and how the paradigms of that journey of encounter may represent a framework for us as a church. In encountering the trauma of sexual and spiritual abuse, we must consider these paradigms of restitution, chaos, and quest.